want to get started with introducing Rob Merriman. Rob has a BA degree in psychology from Randolph-Macon College and also an MSW degree in social work administration. He served in Vietnam and he held the rank of major in the reserves. He joined the staff of the Lynchburg Training School and Hospital in 1972 and retired 30 years later. He is going to share with us looking at the social, economic, and political trends that influenced the colony and its growth.
The training center was in existence for about 100 years. When I came there in 1972, it had already been in effect for about 70 or 80 years. The purpose of me being here is to say that what took place at the training center reflected what was going on across the entire United States. The training center was chartered in 1906 by the Virginia General Assembly. It was for white epileptics who were living at Western State Hospital in Stanton, and they were running out of room. They also got the notion that epileptics maybe shouldn't be mixed in with mentally ill or really seriously ill people, that they should be in a different environment. In 1906, the General Assembly submitted the following bill to establish an epileptic colony on the land of Western State Hospital in Amherst County. Existing state hospitals for the white, insane, are near taxed to their fullest capacity and would be insufficient in the near future for the care of all such unfortunate persons. There are in said hospitals about 250 patients suffering from epilepsy. There is a probability of improvement in cures under special hygienic surroundings, congenial employment, and scientific and medical treatment, which may be available at a separate colony, that being enacted by the General Assembly are authorized and directed to erect on the tract of land in Amherst County opposite the city of Lynchburg by the will of Sidney R. Merkland. It was donated from Merkland, who lived on a place called the Morrisana. One of the boats that was built at the training center, we built a bateau, and I've spent many a trip down the James River on the boat that was named after the plantation. The institution opened in 1911. Since that time, the training center or the colony has been part of Amherst County history. A lot of people think of Lynchburg as an isolated entity. It reflected what was going on in the entire United States. There were changes occurring over time. These changes were economic, there were medical changes, legal changes, technology, politics, and even the naming, the nomenclature. Over the years, literally thousands upon thousands of people passed through the colony. Eugenics is an awkward, difficult term, but that was what the training center was about during the 20s and the 30s on up to the 70s. And that was basically for sterilization. Many, many groups of people, not just epileptics, it was believed that their conditions could be passed on in a hereditary fashion. From the day that it opened, they were practicing sterilization. It was going on at Western State. At that particular time, not to trivialize it, it was no big deal because of the attitudes of society at that time. The people that came there under many different names. They were called epileptics, they were called morons, they were called imbeciles, feeble-minded, idiots, low grade, high grade, profound, mild, and moderately retarded. And these terms today are politically incorrect, if not repugnant. But at one time, they were scientifically and socially accepted. We've come to the point today where we call it a person with developmental disability. A therapeutic environment with fresh air, open spaces, exercise, a good diet, good nutrition was important for people who had disabilities in those days. But in reality, that was really about all they could do because we did not have medical knowledge of what was going on with epilepsy. As we all know, medication came along there, and that was pretty much eliminated from the reason for admission to the training center. Eventually, it became a treatment center for those individuals there who were just not considered part of society. Some of them came there for very real medical needs, but a lot of individuals came there because the community could not deal with them or did not want them. At that time, the localities, Amherst and Campbell County being two examples, were strapped for money, and every county had a poorhouse. The supervisors were very concerned that the indigent people there who went to the poorhouses were taking up a lot of the county money. And so when they opened the training center, a lot of the supervisors said, aha, this is where these folks can go. Some of them just left, but a lot of them went from the poorhouses to the training center. Now, why were they in the poorhouse to begin with? They were in the poorhouse because they lost the farm. Either they had bad luck or they didn't have good management skills to survive. And of course, at the poorhouse, that was an agricultural type of activity. And so they carried with them the skills and the activities there. There were individuals who just couldn't make it in society and who did not have other family resources to fall back on. The county officials, they were just happy as they could be to get rid of the poor farm because they had to pay for that out of county funds. And so when the state established these hospitals, they thought there's some people here that really need to go to the state hospitals. This went on up until about World War I. A lot of people don't believe this, but during World War I, a lot of the men from the training center were drafted. You think for a minute, that has a chilling similarity to Project 1000 during the Vietnam War, where they got people with low abilities there and basically drafted them in Vietnam. They had a terrible casualty rate. So I interviewed quite a few individuals during a lot of the controversy who had been serving in the military. One individual won the Bronze Star. A lot of them did come home from World War I, and guess what? They went right back to the training center. They returned to a setting where it was very agricultural. It was a self-sustaining entity in itself. It was a farm. They grew their own crops. They prepared their own food because there were individuals there that were capable of doing that at that time. And again, you kind of ask yourself, well, what were they doing there to begin with? They came on hard luck and they were there to be sterilized. Supposedly, when a person came there to be sterilized, they would be discharged right after that process. I talked to an individual from Fishersville who was drafted into World War II, and he came to the training center because of truancy. He ran away from home every time the social services took him back home. His father beat the living daylights out of him. The draft board came knocking on his door. He said, oh, ha, you can't draft me because I've been sterilized. And he said, that's not a problem. I reviewed quite a few records of people who were admitted, or in many cases readmitted, because they'd been gassed. And their disability was they couldn't breathe anymore because they had lung problems. Some of the doctors began to be concerned that they may be exposing themselves to legal liability. Suppose one of these individuals came back and sued them. Even back in those days, doctors were concerned about legal liability. The Virginia General Assembly passed the sterilization law in 1924, the Virginia sterilization law. It had been going on, but that made it official, and that the doctors thought that would protect them. Dr. Bell, who had a woman who came to the facility because she had a child out of wedlock, and that was enough reason for her to be sterilized. He was a little bit concerned about this, and so he followed that case. The child that was born out of that situation there, her daughter acted very normal. And they thought, well, but she was still at the colony. And if you were born at the colony, you inherited the same status that your parent had. They placed her in Charlottesville with the family as sort of a domestic servant. And while there, the son, one of the sons of that family there, raped her. And so she was sent back to the training center where she had a child at the training center. Later on, she went back to Charlottesville. The family took that child back. She was enrolled in Charlottesville schools and she was making an honor roll. Now, these are grandmother, mother, and granddaughter. This is what Oliver Wendell Holmes, a Supreme Court justice, used. You've all heard the term, 3 generations of imbeciles were enough. Well, they weren't imbeciles. They were just down on their luck individuals there that we would probably today say at least one of them was mild, maybe moderately retarded. What that Supreme Court case did was Dr. Bell was worried that the Virginia laws would not be enough protection. They kicked it up to the Supreme Court. And given the climate of that time, the social and moral climate, eugenics was very, very well accepted in their society. Oliver Wendell Holmes, who was the most respected jurist, said that was one of the biggest mistakes he ever made in his life. But that stuck. It lasted up until the 70s, because when I went to work at the training center, I used to have to meet with a lot of the assistant attorney generals, and they were just beginning to look at some of these cases there. And most of the young lawyers I talked to said that the extent of their knowledge was 3 generations of imbeciles is enough. And they felt that ended it right there. That law was repealed in 1974. As a matter of fact, when I went to work at the training center in 1972, you always get involved in situations that you look back at. You know, being a young social worker there at that particular time, I sat on a sterilization committee. It was real. I don't think it happened at that time, but it had been put in process. And institutions being institutions, once something was put in process, it kept on going up until 1974. How could anyone disagree with eugenics? Eugenics was supported by Teddy Roosevelt, Margaret Sanger, Alexander Graham Bell. He was a famous proponent of eugenics. Harvard and Yale universities, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Carnegie Foundation, they all funded and supported eugenics. And I point out this was a nationwide effort coming out of Cold Springs in Long Island. They had a big, huge institute there where doctors and academics from all over the country would meet. But it was really fake science. It really was not based on any medically sound principles. It was based on some remote theories of animal breeding and what happens to cows and horses and dogs and stuff like this. And they really felt it should be applied to humans, which was a pretty chilling thought. I point out, sterilization does go on today, but it's for specific needs, specific necessity, and it's got legal safeguards all over the place. But it's chilling to think that someone can come along without any judicial process and just take over take over people on a highly questionable basis. After the Supreme Court decision, and meanwhile back at the training center, it had gone up to 700 people. Still, it was a beneficial place to be, apart from the involuntary sterilization. Fresh air, a lot of good exercise, good food. But the training center very quickly became a victim of its own success. They were providing a good environment. The word got out, people started flooding into the training center. The population began to grow. By 1939, there were 1,800 people just in that short period of time. There were 400 people, however, they were on leave. And that's an interesting thing. Where were these 400 people? These 400 people had been farmed out. They worked on farms, or they were signed as domestic servants in different homes. Most of the apples here in Amherst County were picked by boys from the training center. You think, well, why didn't it just go away? Why didn't it just leave? Well, when they came to the training center, they were committed. This was the legal situation. Anybody who came into any public institution was committed. If you were committed, you had to go through a legal process. You couldn't just dance in there and say, I'm here. And once you went through that legal process, you could no longer make contracts. What's a contract all about? Well, you will never make a contract with a minor, nor with a person who's suffering from mental illness. And so that immediately struck at that right. Along with that, couldn't vote, couldn't get married, couldn't get a driver's license there. There's a whole list of things that you could not do. You couldn't leave the organization that had control over you. If you did, the state had the legal authority that if a young man or a young woman left the training center, the sheriff would go out and arrest them and bring them back. And that was a pretty serious thing. A lot of individuals had no other place to go. They legally could not leave. They were committed to the training center. When I came back from overseas in the mid-'70s, we were camping up at Douthit State Park. And Sunday morning, there was a guy driving around a car. We struck up a conversation. And he said he worked in, I think, Clifton Forge or Covington nearby. He asked me where was I from. And I said, I'm from Lynchburg. And his face just completely went blank. And he just all of a sudden said, oh my God, they're probably still looking for me. He had been there and he had just walked away. So here he is, driving an automobile with a job in Covington, fearful that they were still going to come get him. In 1939, the name was changed to the Lynchburg State Colony. During the 30s, they began to recognize that we need to do something more than just agricultural activities, and they started having some very basic schools. They tried to teach individuals certain academic skills. They also had a lot of trade skills. The big thing then was shoe repair. But then when World War II came along, that upended everything. The doctors left. Most of the male staff were drafted. And so the place was basically deserted. Who was running the training center? It was basically what they then called the high-grade individuals. We're caring for the low-grade individuals. That was pretty much the classification at that time, high-grade, low-grade. A lot of the doctors noticed that the patients seemed to know more about the hospital than the staff, which was probably a reality there. I know one time they always had a big carnival. They always had a big celebration. And one of the military units brought a big tent over there to use for some of the exhibits and such. The services also were provided by conscientious objectors, and many times they could fulfill their military obligation by working in a hospital. Right after World War II, the population grew to 2,000. That's a lot of people they began to really experience overcrowding. They were building buildings like bad, and as soon as they built a new building, it was filled up. At that particular time, they were sleeping in shifts, particularly high-grade people, kind of like on a ship or a submarine. But when one guy had to get up and go to work, another guy came in and took his bed because it was that totally crowded. This is the weird thing. None of the buildings had elevators. You think about the disabilities were increasing, particularly mobility. A lot of problems with ambulation there, but there were hardly any elevators anywhere. In some of the old buildings there, they had ramps, not stairs, but they had ramps. In the Dejarnet building, which is all the way at the end, I think that was built in some of the 20s or the 30s. It had ramps with a big chain link type of separation between the stairwells. It was kind of an eerie thing there. In 1954, the H. Minor Davis building was built. The Lynchburg State Colony became the Lynchburg Training School and Hospital. So it was Lynchburg Training School and Hospital. The term hospital is interesting. In the Code of Virginia, hospital has a specific meaning. Lynchburg Training School and Hospital. That gave it certain legal authority, and I think that may have been connected not just to medical treatment, but that also because they were providing sterilization, that had to be done in a medical setting. The term at that time was patient. Hospital, patient. So that fit. When a new director came along, it was changed to resident. And of course, a lot of the staff got upset because they were used to calling everyone a patient. The vast majority of the individuals were not medical patients. They did not have medical needs. They had care needs. During the 50s and 60s, training was emphasized. A lot of buildings, and I say beautiful buildings there because if you look at a lot of the old buildings there, and then go look at Randolph-Macon Women's College, look at Virginia Baptist College, look at the Presbyterian Home, Stanhope Johnson, a famous Lynchburg architect, built a lot of these buildings there. These were multi-level. And of course, in the 70s and the 80s there, we had spent tons and tons of money putting elevators in all these buildings there. And I often thought the Bradford building, which is the main hospital building, it's a gorgeous building. It's got the white woodwork and the brickwork. And Thomas Jefferson would have been proud of the building. But as far as a functional building to care for people with significant disabilities, at that time, people still did not really know what are we going to do with all these individuals. They really didn't have the idea, no cures for this type of disability. The only thing was improvement or maximizability there. But they could put them in gorgeous, beautiful buildings, and looking from the outside, you'd feel better about it. And so that happened all over the country. You go to some of the old institutions, they're gorgeous buildings. But you step inside, it's a whole totally different situation. In the 50s, the dairy and the farm were closed. A lot of people in Amherst got really upset about that because it was a cherished concept of self-sufficiency and independence. And of course, there were farms all over the country. Well, the reality was it didn't save the state money because you could buy the commodities cheaper on the market. It was much cheaper than the cost and effort to produce it. So it was a cost-saving factor. Didn't really put any of the patients out of work there. Western State Hospital, kind of to go back to that, is now on its third location. I had a lot of painful involvement with the original building. It looks like something out of an Alfred Hitchcock movie, but it's a beautiful, beautiful building. If you're familiar with Stanton, downtown Stanton's being gentrified, and the old Western State Hospital is now a boutique hotel. Here's a place that was used for a lunatic asylum, is used as a state prison. Now it's a boutique hotel because it's got beautiful architecture. In 1957, Dr. Nagler, a lot of buildings over there named after Dr. Nagler, he was a psychiatrist, and I think he was from Germany. He was Jewish, and he was world-renowned for his research. And I think there was a bit of irony here. When he was there, sterilization was still being practiced. And we all know the very difficult association that Americans have with eugenics and with Germany. I don't need to go into that detail there. But Dr. Nagler was German, as a lot of our psychiatrists came from Eastern Europe and different places. After that, a lot of them came from Cuba. A lot of them came from Haiti and different other places, depending upon what was going on in the world. A large number of our nurses came from the Philippines, because when we were short, we would go overseas for staff. Bertha Core. Bertha Core is a wonderful, wonderful name. A dedicated nurse there. We have a building that was named after her. She grew up in the Oddfellows Orphanage. In the 30s and the 40s, orphanages were prevalent. There were 3 in Lynchburg. And you better believe that if you go up in an orphanage, you have good work habits and you receive good training for that. She was a fantastic nurse. She ruled the training center with an iron hand. And at one time, she was just one of 2 nurses there. It grew over time. And she was very protective, very possessive of her nurses on that. And, they did not cross Bertha Core. And one day, one of the nurses came to work. They all wore uniforms back then, starch hats and everything. Came to work in a pantsuit, in a white pantsuit, and she was sent home immediately because Bertha Core did not want the nurses to be confused with food service workers, because food service workers wore white uniforms. Social workers and psychologists at that time wore coat and tie. Schools focused on basic skills. Dr. Charles Wills was the principal there. He dedicated a lot to setting up special what they call summer enrichment programs. They had a special program there for individuals with Down syndrome. Again, another term changed. It used to be called Mongolism. And that was a very ugly term. We don't even use the term Down syndrome any longer. But at that time, Down syndrome was an automatic ticket to the training center. Of course, many Down syndrome individuals are quite capable individuals there. They have some medical problems there. They have a short life expectancy. But we were amazed in the 80s there, an individual with Down syndrome actually graduated from college on that. And it was just unheard of at that particular time. We did not admit anybody with autism because nobody knew what autism was at that time. Autism was essentially a cold-hearted mother. That's what they thought created autism. When I was there, because it was so large, the main focus was on numbers. How many people here? How many people there? You really didn't have time to look at people as individual human beings. It was groups in huge numbers. The groupings, obviously, you had male and female. You had the high grade. You had the low grade. You had nursery. Little kids, because we were having infants that were being admitted. We had the adult development center for the older people, sort of like a home for old folks there. And so they were grouped in different parts of the campus. We began to sort of specialize the campus. And believe it or not, we had an independent living center where about 100 people lived with no staff. In other words, they ran the place themselves. That was the old Smith Center down there. And that was built to be an independent. Because meantime, I'm thinking, what the devil were these people doing here to begin with on that? And that really did not occur to anyone until 1974. 1974 was one of the biggest changes that the training center had, and that's where a guy, Dr. Nelson, came along. I haven't talked to him for years and years, and I don't know if he's still around or not. Dr. Nelson was sort of a Rasputin-type personality who brought about tremendous changes to the training center. He was extremely controversial. Don Pendleton, a lot of you remember Don Pendleton, went to war with Ray Nelson because he was upsetting the work schedules. He was upsetting the characterization of a lot of the clients there, and he just seemed to enjoy controversy. But he brought about some of the most important changes by reorganizing the training center from a strictly custodial medical model to a developmental model. In other words, everything that happens there is going to be towards developing the skills, developing the abilities, not just keep them in place, which is basically what he was doing. So when he got there were about 2,000 people. The crowding was horrible. The state told him, you can't admit people any longer, that you've got to do something to reduce the census. Several of the things that we did, and we did some pretty wild things here, we rented Father Judge Seminary for 2 years. For 2 years, the training center ran Father Judge Seminary. We converted one of the dairy barns into a dormitory. Sounds pretty grim, but the crowding was that bad. And of course, it was a beautiful, beautiful building on that. I had to do a lot of work on the inside, but the overcrowding was so horrible. And even though the state said you cannot admit any more people, there were still people coming in. From that point on, there was sort of that dichotomy between you're overcrowded, what are you going to do about it? but you got to admit these people because they really need to come into the training center. We introduced what was called the unit system. Rather than just having one big massive institution, we broke it down into different groups, and this really upset the social workers and psychologists and some of the nurses. Said you're no longer in the nursing department, you're no longer in the psychology department, you're going to go out to a team. And so they organized teams, a specialist, to work with individuals who had specific needs. Had a team that worked with the real younger, the nursery group, with medical developmental needs. We had a team that went to the independent living center, and because their programs were focused on independence. A team that went to the multi-handicapped. These were individuals that had a lot of ambulation problems there, a lot of spasticity problems there. Ray Nelson was also the guy that broke open the whole sterilization controversy. Like I said, that had been going on all along. It was, beneath the surface. No one really thought anything about it there. Ray Nelson found Emma Buck and her sister living in Charlottesville, and he interviewed them, and he wrote a book, along with Paul Lombardi from the University of Virginia, on the sterilization process. That book was a bombshell. The people in Richmond got a hold of that book and they thought, what in the world has been going on at Lynchburg? There were all kinds of investigations. The state realized that they had better start to backpedal. Some of these things had been going on all the time. And so that's when they sent the attorneys there to meet and to look at the records. And of course, an institution being an institution, the institution kept damn good records. Guess what? And so a couple of the attorneys I met with said, Rob, why the hell did y'all get rid of these records? Because now we've got to explain what's been going on, all this time here. And of course, human rights was just beginning to stick its head up. It was side by side with civil rights, women's rights, African American rights, and so on. And it was sort of rights of the handicapped. Ray Nelson, he also made another dramatic announcement. He said, the people here at the training center have rights just like anybody in the community. And, they can get a driver's license, they can vote. If they're able to, they can get married. That really upset people. But like I said earlier, a lot of individuals could get driver's licenses. And of course, we did initiate a big voting campaign. I don't know, how much impact that had on the individual there, but it made society feel better that we were now protecting those rights. Another big change was the change in the legal system. I said earlier, Code of Virginia, the commitment laws, and if you were committed, the only way you could get out of it was to be certified as improved. And if you're mentally ill, a psychiatrist can say, okay, he's not mentally ill any longer and he's improved. But if you're mentally retarded, on that mental retardation is essentially forever. It just, you maximize what you got. And so a lot of people had trouble with I'm not going to say he's improved. The lawyers had to go back to work there, and they came up with judicial certification was a legal term which meant that there was no other alternative for this person in the community. They couldn't go to a group home because group homes didn't exist at that time. And a lot of families just couldn't care. A judge certified that there were no other alternatives there. But it got out from under this stripping away their total rights. It was totally voluntary. A family could remove an individual at any time. The person could get up and walk out of there at any time. By that time, we weren't admitting people that were capable of getting up and walking out of there. I guess one of the biggest changes that I saw there was the introduction of Medicaid. People with hard luck, people in a bad situation, used to be a poorhouse. That got kicked up to a state hospital. And that was state funding. I used to go to meetings in Richmond where the administrators would brag about how little they had to spend per patient. And I'm thinking, wait a minute, this could be not so much a compliment to the care if you minimize your spending. When Medicaid came along, we had funding like we'd never had before. In other words, it was federal funding. We were able to recruit staff. That opened up a whole different era of programs there. At that particular time, we also introduced another novel idea of, do these individuals have to stay here all their life? Is there a place in the community that they can go to, particularly if they're from Winchester, or if they're from Danville or Bristol or something? Even if the families wanted to, they could not visit because of the distances. And so the idea of, would it be nicer if this person was closer to where their family, where they came from? And now, again, not to be cynical, but a lot of families actually did care for their family members that were there. I worked with a lot of different families, and you can imagine the gut-wrenching realization that their son or daughter was not going to develop the way that their brothers and sisters or their cousins might develop, and it was pretty medically determined that was going to happen. And at one time, the training center, back in the old days, they told families, don't come back. Leave them here, don't visit. Prior to World War II, that was pretty much accepted practice. It was hard for families to visit. It was hard for them to come over there because they had to go through all kinds of loopholes and stuff like that to get to visit their relative there. But with judicial certification, they could walk out of there anytime they wanted to. Meanwhile, we had about 2,000 people. Ray Nelson, the guy that did a lot of these changes there, he used to brag about it was the largest mental retardation facility in the world. And I thought, Ray, that's not a real claim to fame there. But he would go to meetings and conferences. He was an extremely talented individual, a very forceful individual, but he had a big ego. And a lot of people in these positions had big egos. After Ray Nelson, another dramatic change came. The next director was Jennifer Fedora. That really upset a lot of people. This is back in the early 80s there, but she was probably the most effective director that the facility had in terms of bringing change out of Ray Nelson's beneficial chaos. And I say his chaos was beneficial because he shook up the system. She kind of set the ship. We started on a real meaningful downsizing program. At that time, the handwriting was kind of on the wall that institutions were fading as a primary source of care. We were having a really hard time getting staff. We were having a hard time reducing the census. And the obsession was, if you go over census, you're going to lose your Medicaid funding. At that time, Chapter 10 boards, that was Chapter 10, the Code of Virginia, organized the development of community services boards. Here in Lynchburg, it's called Horizons. I'm on the board of Horizons at the present time. I helped develop one of the first group homes, I guess in the late 70s. Very meaningful to see those programs develop. The changes that have occurred after that was a gradual diminishment of the training center. A lot of controversy there. Amherst has had problems getting that property because the state, in its lack of foresight, was spending money building buildings even when they knew the place was going to close. The 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 buildings, what we used to call the Child Development Center, was refurbished with high-tech equipment. They just ripped everything out, and they spent, I believe it was $25 million to refurbish it. Sometime, I think in the late 90s or the early 2000s, I don't know the dates. I wasn't there. It must have been the early 2000s. But they spent tons and tons of money on places that could be closed. Now, has that ever happened before? When I was overseas, I was leaving a base there that we knew was going to close because we were moving out of that area. The Navy was building a new nursery for the families there, a place that was going to close in 2 years. So that's the government. I don't mean disparagingly, but they'll let a contract, they'll get the money based upon a need. The need was 5 or 10 years ago, and by the time the actual building got there, the need had gone away. And that's what happened at the training center, and that's why it was just fantastic when the state finally, I think the term is they defeased the $25 million so that Amherst could take it on, because I don't think Amherst would have touched it with a $25 million debt hanging around. The training center right now is a big part of Amherst County, but it's part of a lot of stuff that was going on in the United States there. And you think, well, yeah, is it completely gone? We still got the cemetery over there. I want to go back over there sometime and visit. I visited the grave of Emma Buck of the Buck versus Bell Supreme Court. She's buried there. The acreage, when driving here today, if you drive across the Monacan Bridge, you're driving over the land that the men farmed there. If you look real hard to your left, you can see the two water towers. The training center actually had a railroad line that ran up to right below the main administration building where the power plant was. The power plant was for the entire campus. Impossible to maintain nowadays. But it's all still there. It's really kind of has an important legacy. I think a lot of the buildings are going to go. I hope that some of them will be kept there. The training center does have a legacy, and the legacy is most of the teachers at Lynchburg College were trained at the training center. Most of the group homes, halls, cabinets, there's a host of group homes right now. They were employees of the training center. They set up the group homes there. So the training center is, in a way, alive and well. It still exists in that legacy. Buildings are meaningless unless you have a really relevant program, something that's relevant to the time. All buildings do is make you feel good when you're standing outside.